You are listening to the Prepared Warrior Podcast, where law enforcement and military trainers discuss cutting-edge training, tactics, and technology. Here is your host, John Wilson.
You are listening to Season 2, Episode 9 of the Prepared Warrior. I'm John Wilson. Our guest for this episode is Sergeant Kelly Keith. I like to start every episode with a quote. This one is from Justin Langer, who said, "The pain of discipline is nothing like the pain of disappointment." All right, my guest for today's program, I'm welcoming back Sergeant Kelly Keith. Now, Kelly Keith has 32 years of police experience. He served with the Winnipeg Police Service as a General Patrol Constable, plainclothes detective, and undercover drug officer. He has also served with the Victoria Police Department, and while employed was seconded to the Justice Institute of British Columbia as a sergeant in charge of use of force and physical training. He then served with the Atlantic Police Academy as an inspector in charge of officer safety, use of force, physical training, communication tactics, and tactical firearms. Now, Kelly has extensive practical experience working the street and dealing with use of force, from officer presence up to dealing with assaultive males with knives and handguns. He's also taught instructors extensively in the United States and a handful of times internationally in use of force related topics. Kelly has testified in use of force related cases in various provinces within Canada and has been declared a use of force expert for court purposes across Canada. Thanks so much for coming on the program, Kelly.
Thank you for having me.
So for today's program, I was thinking we're going to get into reality-based training and some of the issues that have come up with the instructors. And so first thing I want to ask, what do you think is the number one thing most trainers get wrong when delivering reality-based training and scenario training?
I think it would be, in my experience, that they're not increasing the difficulty of the scenarios to answering the real world problems. So we have scenarios that are developed that are I call black and white scenarios, such as academy level student scenarios, which I totally believe in and think we need to do this. As a starting point for reality-based training, and a black and white scenario, an example might be the fact that, the officers are attending to a male with a knife, a hammer, axe, or something, and the officer gets to the location, starts to de-escalate the situation, and at some point the subject's going to run and attack the officer with a knife, stating that he's going to kill him. So those would be, it's a black and white situation in regards to, the officer has the grounds, the weapon intent delivery system is all completed. There's not a lot of differences that should occur from that. And understanding from the academy perspective, they've already been taught up to the point of what exactly the instructor is looking for from the officer, whether it is to, move and shoot, run to cover, so on and so forth. All of those things aside, there isn't a thought process the officer has to go through of what should I do outside of course, a tactic that was taught to him from that instructor. However, once students have gone through those types of scenarios where they're very basic scenarios, and the officer gets more experience on the street and gets more seasoned in regards to how to deal with things and distances and everything else, we need to make scenarios that are not straight black and white scenarios. We need to make scenarios that are ones that engage the officer's brain. They're run at real speed, and there's a real possibility that at the end of the scenario, when the instructor asks a question, if you had the chance to go through this scenario again, would you do anything different? That they actually say, yes, I probably would have done this, and I would have done this, and I would have done this differently. Which is excellent from an instructor standpoint, because then we realize that if what they're saying is what I would want them to do, that they understood it, they just didn't do it. So we can deal with that as an instructor differently. But at the end of the day, if we're running students through scenarios and everybody's passing scenarios, or they're not coming through those scenarios and there's actual stress on them, or at the end when I'm saying to them, is there anything that you would do differently? They say no, and that was the same answer that I was thinking as well. I thought everything was done well. Then at that point, we aren't putting them to a real test. I do some expert court testimony, as you alluded to a little earlier. And one thing that generally speaking, anybody that does court testimony, we're not required for is something that is black and white, something that is, we're attending to a call, someone shoots at us, we shoot back, and it's whatever the injuries are as a result of that, unless there's nothing outside of that, they don't need experts to go to court and testify. Where the problems come in a lot of times are when there's some what I call gray areas in the scenarios, and the scenarios aren't just simple, straightforward, easy ones that officers don't have to engage their brain into and really at real-time speed react to. I think most instructors are actually very, very good at providing scenarios that have clear and easy solutions. And as recruits, this is a perfect place to start, like I mentioned. But we need to move on from those and give more challenging ones as years go on. And we need to have those scenarios that as people with experience go in, that they know they're going to come and actually truly get tested. So I equate it to fitness. Like I've been a fitness instructor for many years in many variety of training methodologies. And so let's say I take a student and somebody that's trying to get fitter, and we start with a bench press, let's just say. So we go in and we do a bench press, and we see that at 95 pounds, this person's starting point, he gets 10 repetitions in for that 95 pounds. And as he's going through, he continues working out, and after 10 years, he's now benching 225 pounds for 10 reps. But then when testing time comes up, I load the bar with 95 pounds to test his bench press capabilities. So at that point, he's bored. There's no challenge to him. He's not stressed out by that. There's nothing that he's going to walk away with, thinking he needs to improve. So what we want to do is in the gray scenarios that I talked about, we look at the officers. So is it an emergency response team that's running through it? Is it seasoned officers that have been working in a very tough neighborhood? So we look at what level that student is, and we build out scenarios that are going to challenge them. And what we're looking for is although we're going to set them up for success because we're going to test them, on things that we've discussed or taught or gone over with them in other little flash scenarios maybe, or in the classroom, when it gets down to real time, there's going to be some point where they're, what should I do? I'm not quite sure what I want to do, how I want to move, or so on and so forth. And I'll give you an example of a gray scenario, and this is how I start a lot of my classes. Is I'll take a student, and if I put him in a corner so that he has no exit available to him, and I don't have to give context, and I don't give context in a lot of the scenarios that I'll run. I think context is good for certain things, and we have to give context for some scenarios, but we don't have to give context for a lot of other scenarios. And so with this situation, I might put them in the corner. I'm going to tell them when you turn around. So they're going to have all nothing obviously lethal on them at this point. They're all completely searched. The safety portion of it is all dealt with. But I say, when you turn around, there's going to be a situation, deal with it. So at that point, I get them to understand they're still facing the corner. I move back and I place a gun beside me on the table. And I yell at them, okay, turn around. Now, when they turn around, I yell, I'm going to fucking kill you in 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then I'll pick the gun up and I'll shoot. So from that perspective, I then, take a look at what the officer did, and then I talk to the classroom and I'll say, okay, so let's say in this case, the officer waited for me to move towards the firearm. So I said, I'm going to kill you in 5 seconds, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and I start moving my hand towards the gun, and he shoots. So I'll talk to the class, and I'll say, so at this point, what if he turns around and I tell him again, I'm going to fucking kill you in 5 seconds. I'm aggressively saying that to him. And he turns around, pulls his firearm, and shoots. So I haven't reached for the gun. I made no motion to it. I did look at it. And we get the class discussion as, is that justified shooting? So in essence, what I get here is I do get discrepancies in regards to, what the class feels is appropriate. And even if, even what I do get a lot of, though, is when I say that to the student or to the people in the audience, the officers, is I say, would it be justified? They're thinking. So even that thinking process allows me to understand that it isn't black and white, because they can't just say, well, of course you could. They're having to go through a process where they're trying to, analyze it and see that. Now, an officer on the street, for example, wouldn't have that same sort of time to do that. That's my example of what I would call a gray scenario. Some people would say to do this, to do that, and it's just they'll have to think about that in the aftermath of, okay, so what if I did reach down, pick it up right away? Or if you're cornered, because remember, you can't go anywhere, you're in that corner, I've got distance to be able to pull it out at any point in time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. So with gray area, it's important for people to learn, I guess, progress, from the basic scenarios to something complex that involves a lot of thought. And I guess, where people don't agree, obviously, right? That's the main point, is makes people think and they come up with different solutions. So does it happen where, for instance, the instructors wouldn't agree on the solution, and what happens in that case? Do you have to have it agreed upon by the instructor beforehand?
Oh, so that's excellent, because that's exactly what happens. I generally only teach instructors, so it's people that are going to become instructors or recertifying instructors, and lots of times there's discrepancy in regards to at what point can you shoot. And then, and not allowing officers to put any other things into place there. Well, what if this and what if that? It is what it is. I'm dressed as I am, which is I'm not dressed in a police uniform or anything like that when I'm teaching. It is what it is. But the whole point of that is that's a positive. If we can get people to see that we're maybe not even all on the same page when it comes down to those sorts of things, then we have some work to do. And what it forces us as instructors to do is to ensure that if we're going to run a scenario where I'm going to test to see when is weapon intent and delivery system complete, and lots of different ways to say weapon intent delivery system. So I'm just saying that most officers would understand what that means. But at the end of the day, when could I pull a trigger if I'm an officer. That's a positive. But at this point, if I've done it in the scenario and we've gone through things and I've talked to the subject matter experts in regards to to the department they're in, because we wouldn't want somebody that's an instructor of use of force doing something different from a subject matter expert. And then I've made sure that I've talked to Crown attorneys to make sure that they aren't going to now that I'm talking about this and I'm saying, well, you can do this, and I give my opinion on that, which I have to watch that it isn't going to be not in concert with the people, the policies and the subject matter experts in the Crown that's going to actually proceed to it. But then when I can say, well, I've talked to the Crown and the Crown attorney believes that, it is complete at this time, and this is the Crown's name that I spoke to. So I want to make sure that once I start going into gray scenarios that I've done my own research. And as well, that if we've got different instructors that are teaching, that those instructors are all on the same page. Whether they believe that, it's right or wrong, in when I'm saying, so if that person that turns around and just pulls his gun and shoots without me reaching towards that firearm, we're all as instructors going to give the same test to the student officer. We're also all going to be backed by the people that we've checked with in that scenario about, and we're going to have a front that's going to be the same. So we have to do our research in gray scenarios, and there's lots. We'll get into that a little later, but lots of different gray scenarios that we can go through as well.
So you're saying instructors need to put in a little extra work for these gray scenarios to be useful. A little extra legwork and making sure that these problems are kind of solved beforehand and they're not just guessing.
Yeah, absolutely. Like there's lots of times even in court where two subject matter experts, one for the Crown, one for the defense, can have differing opinions. When I'm teaching and I get the class that aren't agreeing on something, I think that's a major bonus, because now is the time in the classroom to say, all right, so it's a good thing that you guys aren't agreeing to it, and then maybe even have some case law that I show, some case law that is recent that shows that this person did it, and the case law shows that as a result of that the officer was found guilty or innocent. And that's exactly what we don't want officers to run through all things, ace everything. When I say we don't want to, of course ultimately we do, but that scenario we put towards them obviously wasn't challenging enough if we don't get some people doing one thing, others doing other things. And my whole point to this is we're going to challenge them each and every scenario that we have with something that isn't just they could do in their sleep.
But wouldn't extremely clear scenarios make the training easier to defend, and so you can show what's clearly right or wrong in a scenario, or is that not useful?
Absolutely, it's useful, and but the thing is if we get into the gray scenarios and we can clarify those first, it actually makes the black and white stand out that much more. So we're able to do that, and as I mentioned when I first started talking, we're not going to ever take students and put them in a grayer scenario or a harder scenario without ensuring that we're setting them up for success. But it's not going to be just a mindless task. So we're going to set them up for success just like we would with that black and white or an easier scenario. But the issue with some of the easier scenarios are when there isn't an argument or disagreements or people that say, well, I think we should have done this or I think we should have done that. They're easy to make up, but they're also the ones that most officers don't need our help with. Those are the ones that the officers, we don't need to spend that extra time training. We need to spend those officers dealing with things that are going to be to their level of training or to their level, or things that, are going to make them engage their brain into it. But just to be clear on what I'm saying here, there should be a right answer to that question. Well, when can you shoot that person? But what is gray about that is the fact that not all people will know exactly maybe when to do it. So the outside of that is gray, but the answer that all instructors are going to have is we are going to make that clear to them when it's finished as to what our beliefs are, and case law and subject matter experts, and with some Crown attorneys involved in that equation.
So I guess the purpose would be with the instructors, knowing the outcome of a gray scenario and what the proper result they're hoping for would be you wouldn't have a high number of failures, even though these are very difficult, because you kind of imagine there'd be a lot more people having trouble with these scenarios, even those with experience.
Yeah, and it depends on how complex we get. So what's the level of our student? If we're talking failures, it's just they might have different tactics, which is always something that as instructors, when we're doing reality-based training, we should be on the lookout for. And I'll give you an example. I was doing a course one time where there was a handgun they were doing a traffic stop, and there was a handgun on the subject that was driving, and then the subject displayed the handgun. But now when I was watching this, what was interesting was students were doing all sorts of different things as a result of that. So there wasn't which is fine. Now, if all students get briefed that, you wound up shooting them, and because, the role player in the car is the one that, the officer in charge is controlling or advising that subject when to go down. At the end of the day, what we'd want to do, though, is take a look at all the different things that people did, and then as instructor cadre is go, okay, so what do we want our guys to be doing in this? What is the safest? What is the tactic that we want to see guys do, and ensure that I would take from that and go, man, I didn't set them up for success if people were doing all sorts of different things. As instructors, we need to take that on and go, okay, we got to backtrack a bit, and we're going to have to go and train what it is that we would want someone to do in that same situation, versus everybody walks away feeling that they did the exact same, they did perfect and they can choose which tactic is the best, versus the instructors trying to determine that. So it's not that the outcome maybe was different in this scenario. In this scenario, the driver was shot many times, but what is the most advantageous tactic to teach as a result of that?
So it seems like there's a lot of benefit to doing these gray scenarios. Do you think instructors avoid doing these for any particular reason?
Well, they're tougher to make up. There definitely creates there's some arguments and disagreements in the class. So as an instructor, we actually promote that. We promote not respectful disagreements, or arguments, but we promote people to challenge us throughout the entire time. So even if I said from that the vehicle one, that's not so much a gray scenario. What I was trying to get at with that was the tactics being so differently is something that we also have to be watching for at all scenarios. But the fact is that this is an open forum in reality-based training, and everybody should have input. Everybody should be able to say, well, I'd like to do it this way, or why don't we do it this way, or I think that if I have to wait until you move towards that firearm before you can shoot, or we want that to be an open. So I think it's how we as instructors promote people to feel free to challenge us at all times, saying, that we don't know everything, but we've done our homework also, and that's where I'm talking about getting the subject matter experts and the Crown attorneys and case law. What's out there to show that, if somebody challenges us to say we can turn around and shoot right away, that we can, and somebody says no, you can't, that we can say, well, this is who we've checked with, and this is the background that we've done up to this point. So this is why we believe that that's complete. And I'm just going to go a little bit further in that when I talk about this in the gray scenarios, and that scenario that I did where I'm testing somebody's weapon intent and delivery system of, that I'm going to kill you in 5 seconds. And, in training, and many officers and departments use the training video of the Dinkeller shooting, which is horrific and hard to watch, to be honest with you. But when people watch the video, they'll watch that video and they'll say, even in recruits, they'll say, oh, he should shoot, and how come he waited, or how come he this, and that's the fact of the matter is, though, when those same students, when I put them through scenarios that are basically of the same caliber of threat, where they have to make a decision of the when to shoot, it's amazing how many people, even that in class, might have been saying, oh, he should have done, or he should have done this, but that's not how it plays out. Now you put it into the scenario, we're almost, we're trying to give that person the last chance to not do what we see him doing. And it's why, the principles, and this is a really big point to me out of reality-based training, is that we're teaching principles and not specifics. So we're teaching officers principles that they can apply to different situations. So whether it is the fact that, we're in our high-risk takedowns, somebody stops when we put the siren on from behind, and we do a high-risk stop, that then the principles that we're laying down in regards to whether we're going to get out of the car, take cover, where do we take cover, are going to come into place when we throw them into a scenario where it's a high-risk situation. They're supposed to do a high-risk stop, and it's a face-on, car-to-car, nose-to-nose situation, high-risk stop. Do they apply principles that were taught there, and be able to take the principles and apply the principles of our tactics to different scenarios, and not just have stay out of crossfire, and you're doing a common traffic stop with 2 officers and subject, a driver and a passenger. We want them to apply that to whether it's a tubular assault or whether we're like principles. And that's what we're coming out of reality-based training with. We're not coming out with how to do an exact situation that if this is duplicated. We want, at the end of reality-based training, for them to understand the fundamental principles that we've laid the foundation for, and apply those to all the reality-based training scenarios.
Do you think across certain agencies and instructors, the principles are different, or they teach different tactics, and makes it kind of hard to focus on those fundamentals?
Well, different departments definitely teach different tactics. Like, I teach both stress vest and simunition scenarios, and it doesn't, from department to department, the actual tactics they teach are definitely different. And then it's a matter of sometimes, when you go through reality-based training, you're also, and I know I've got a monkey brain here, but when we're going through, we actually see that this tactic's being taught, but yet when we're doing reality-based training, that we're putting them into the tactics that we're expecting them to do. They're not doing it. They're doing something else, and that might be because the fact of the matter is you're working against somebody's natural inclination to do something else on that stress that you're putting them through. But that's, again, as instructors, when we see that's something that, we're only going to see if we're putting them in situations that that we've applied the proper amount of stress factors to that scenario, and we're applying the scenario to the level of the student, and we're not like you're going to see exactly what you want to see if it's a black and white scenario, generally speaking. But when you get into scenarios that aren't, and you get into some complex where maybe you've got multiple shooters, or you've got people that are doing things that may not be common or unusual weapons, or many other things, that's where you see, are they applying those principles we taught? So we as instructors need to take that on our shoulder and say, okay, we expected this, but that's not what they did. And just a real simple thing is, in the police academies, and maybe I'm hopefully not just speaking for myself, people listening, but, you get taught how to do compliant handcuffing, and where you tell them to, look the other, or, show hands. They turn around, you spread their ankles, they lean over at the waist, they look over the back, and then we approach them in this manner. But I hate to say this, but maybe this is just in my own career, but I've never seen that tactic used in 32 years. So my point to this all is, different people do different tactics, different departments. Yes, this is the best time if we can make some scenarios that are complex and get guys thinking. Where do they automatically turn to? Do they turn to tactics, or do they turn to something else? And if they turn to something else, how is it that we can now, if we want them to do those tactics, how is it that we can drive it through to them that this might be something? And again, if it's working against their natural inclination, though, that's not going to work. They're going to do what they're going to do. And we need to somehow work our tactics into that, so they have to be stress congruent to, like, our tactics have to be stress congruent. But again, you're only going to get that if you've got that officer in a heightened state of stress.
Now, you've mentioned a few examples, but can you give a good list of examples of gray scenarios to help other instructors who might be listening?
Yeah. So, and again, I want to just reiterate one thing is, I know lots of times, even when I'm going over these gray scenarios, that they may not appear gray when I'm talking about them. And, when I was watching the news after the Atlanta shooting, I was so disappointed to see somebody on the news that was of a law enforcement background state, if I was in that situation, I would have. As soon as somebody says that, I just cringe, because I go, you weren't in the situation. And it's easy to say in hindsight that this is easy. It's easy to say in hindsight, well, if this was real, I would have. And even in lots of reality-based training, that's exactly what people come back with is, well, if this was real, I would have done this and this and this. And I discourage that to even come up. I say, I want you to act as if this is real. Nothing is out of bounds unless I've told you it's out of bounds. So you can do what you can do, and with obviously some safety precautions of the training safety officer is going to be calling ceasefire if there's something of safety values. But if I go through a few, and I'm just going to do a couple here, but if we go through these, it might seem, well, there's nothing great about that. This is what I'm going to do. But what I'd urge you to do is, even on that scenario that I talked about the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, see where you're at and run it through the students before telling them anything's going to happen. And I will guarantee you are going to see shots being fired at all different places in that situation. But if I'm speaking it in words, it comes across and people will go just like the fool that said, well, if I was in that position, that's what I would have done. Under stress is different. Okay, so the first scenario that I'm going to give you is the officer is going to be told that there's a 1033 or an officer needs assistance call. He's attending to, he hears this over the radio. There was shots fired in the background, so he heard those shots over his radio. And then the officer in charge is going to tell him that it took you 3 minutes to arrive, go. And once he says that, the officer will come upon a room where there's going to be one entry point. Cover is available to that officer that's attending. What that officer sees is there's the shot officer's inside the room, that the attending officer has room to be able to see, and there's moaning, and he's loud, claiming that he's being shot. In the doorway is a distraught male. So the doorway being between the attending officer and the shot officer. The distraught male, he's pacing back and forth in the doorway, and in that doorway is also visible a very big blood mat, showing that there's a fair bit of blood coming from the shot officer. The distraught male is holding the officers that had been shot, his firearm. He's holding it awkwardly, though, so that he would need to reposition the gun in his hand in order to shoot the attending officer. The distraught male is wearing bulky clothes. If they try a less lethal, it's going to have failed. So even if they do try it, the officer in charge is going to say a probe missed. Let's say if they did a taser. So generally speaking, at this point, the attending officer will be yelling, drop the gun, doing that. So initially, the distraught male will not respond to that officer, but he's going back and forth and apologizing to the officer that he shot. He's very excited, and he's saying I can't believe this happened. I didn't want this to occur. And he's just very frantically moving within that door so that nobody could just walk through or get by him. He's standing right in the doorway. So as the attending officer continues to yell that to drop the gun, the distraught male will at some points be addressing him after initially ignoring him, but say no, he can't do that because the attending officer is going to shoot him if he drops the gun, and he's apologizing to the attending officer, but going back and forth with paying attention to the attending officer and to the officer that he shot. As this is all going on, the shot officer, his moaning and everything is getting weaker and weaker as time is passing. So what we're looking at in this situation is what sort of verbals is the attending officer using. So is he recognizing that the shot officer is we could fear for that shot officer, being that he is in fear of dying by bleeding out. So with a big blood mat and the shots that he heard over there, combined with the fact that his voice is slowly getting weaker and weaker. So the responding officer is what's his commands and what's his verbiage to that about, is he talking to that person, telling him what he might have to do if he doesn't drop that gun, or at least, advising him that the concern isn't him, it's the officer, and he needs to go help him. At this point, obviously the concern still is that person, but the fact of the matter is his real hurry is that the officer is going to bleed out. So does he recognize that? And then is that attending officer, is he speaking to the shot officer to try and get some information from that shot officer as well? And what we do with these a lot of times, we put a time limit on. So somebody can bleed out in 5 minutes. So we're going to see they took them 3 minutes to get there. We're going to see at what point do they, and we have and this is all based on, again, matching the scenarios to the attending officer that's going through this scenario's abilities. So it's going to take somebody maybe that's trained, maybe an emergency response team member, less time maybe to figure out that the person's bleeding out and so on and so forth. But we're going to match that time to what we believe the class's skill level is at. And really, at the end of the day, there's lots of good talking points in this, but it's getting out of the black and white scenarios. I'm going to discuss some more scenarios, but with less information. I know it's hard to actually, without a visual, go through these so you can really see exactly what the attending officer is looking at and the threats and what can go through that officer's mind. But I can tell you this, I've ran this scenario many times, and I get very, very different responses, and it is a good discussion piece at the end with lots of good points that can come out of it. But because it takes a lot of time to try and describe this to give it any benefit of you seeing them, I'm just going to go over some smaller scenarios that hopefully you get the kind of the general gist of. An active killer that's running away, shooting, backwards even, but there's a lot of innocent people in the front. So we get, in the 4 basic firearm safety things, we have the fact that, is our background safe, and what is beyond that? Well, here the background isn't safe. So we're going to have that background so that there is no way that it is safe. So again, at what point does that officer decide that he's going to take those shots? Things that are even subjects lose their weapons, and again, I'm not whether it be losing a taser in my own police department, I've seen that occur. So, but losing tasers or losing OC spray. Or other weapons that are on you that are considered less lethal, but under a stressful situation, what are those reactions? Another one, a lone officer known to carry a gun. He's arrestable. He's walking towards the officer with his hands in his pockets. So, and again, if they use a less lethal, if that we allow that, we might decide to allow that if that was our object of it. But it wasn't successful, or and understanding for all these scenarios, like even I go back to that situation where I said, I corner the officer. And I say, I'm going to kill you in 5 seconds. So if I didn't corner him and I put him by a door, that changes that whole, that's an entirely different scenario now if I've left him an area that he can just, go out through. So in these cases here, we're setting them up so we're going to set a scenario up so we're going to be able to achieve what we want to achieve. And that's that in this case here, we want, if this is the time that we want them to go to their intermediate weapon, then that's going to be it. But in this case here, if I want to force that officer to make a decision of whether he's going to shoot or not, pending some motions of what that officer is doing, then we're gonna make the scenario so that it is like that. We have a large role player coming at a sole officer with a pencil in his hand. His fist is clenched down at his waist, but again, coming at him in a distance where it's a decision of the intermediate weapon doesn't work. He now needs to deal with that in another manner with a larger person with with a pencil even in his hand. Sorry. I try to look at lots of different use of force things. And in Phoenix, recently there was a shooting where a male came out, and lots of differences of opinion from the naysayers and everything. But he was, he had one hand up in the air and the other he had a gun that was behind him, and so those are things. Having somebody answer a door with a weapon is not. It's one of those things that can be foreseeable, and I'm absolutely not saying the officers did wrong, and I totally am not saying that. So I want to make sure that I'm just saying that if we see something like that, and it's something that we can look at and we can go, gee, have we trained that? Is from one angle, it was a completely different scenario than the other angle as well. So, one officer had one angle of it, which, from the body cams you get to see. The other officer had a completely different scenario thrown at him because it wasn't the same in regards to what their visuals were. So, and I'll just touch on that for a second as well, because even if for all scenarios, we can set scenarios up as best that we can, and then somebody can go through that scenario and gather a different perception of what was occurring from that. This is why we need to make reality-based training student-driven, and they do all the talking initially. But from those sorts of things, we have to take a look at it from a perceptual way and say, okay, so is that a reasonable perception that they believed was happening? So their actions might be not what we believed it, like we weren't expecting from any officer. But when they're doing their debrief, they say, well, I thought this was X, Y, Z, and we have to make a decision of, is that explanation reasonable? Because although it might be reasonable to them, doesn't mean the courts are going to believe it's reasonable. So someone will say, well, if they articulate it right, then we have to, as long as they articulate it right, then it could be justified. Well, it's true to an extent, but that reasonableness still has to be there. So would an officer in a similar situation come up with that same perception, or is that perception not reasonable? And I've had to deal with that entire situation in court on a case that I was dealing with. So yeah, those are some of the just some gray scenarios. There's we do a real bad one that's involving a baby. Yeah, it's a doll we use, just in case anybody thinks we use any real babies. We don't. It's a doll we use. And, it's where, at what point in time is grievous bodily harm or death met. So, and it's a scenario where the threat comes to the subject placing a baby on the ground and raising his foot. So the second that foot gets raised, grievous bodily harm or death is met. But again, coming from that, the function of it's not what we believe is. We have to. There's a processing time that goes on in the brain to what is this no, and then but all that time is there's a time limit that we'd put on it pending the value of the experience of the students.
I see. Yeah. So that's a lot of intense examples in those gray scenarios. How important is it to keep an eye on what happens in the real world and using those as kind of inspiration for scenarios? Because sometimes I guess you don't think of something until you see it, in a body cam footage or on the news.
Oh, I think it's and again, I want to go back to principles, because it's not like I don't need to run the exact same scenario and people remember how to deal with this, how to deal with a man that is doing the exact same thing. I want people to walk away with principles in regards to this situation. So, and I'll just go back to the gun, I'm going to kill you in 5 seconds. That same principle was in place with the Dink Heller murder, or it's in place where somebody's running, trying to get to a firearm, or it's in place where somebody's reaching over to grab it. And so it's really important to watch the news is the answer. It's important to see, I have some good friends that send me Instagram things. I know absolutely nothing about social media. I suck. But he'll send me the videos and stuff, and I look at them, and then I don't break down that exact scenario, but I do take a look at the principles in there and say, what is the critical components of that situation that I watched, and have we trained people for that if it was to occur in this situation. And, I'll mention this as well as, even in I wrote an expert report that at the summation of my report, I firmly believe that regardless of whether the judge decided that the officer was innocent or guilty, that it was my opinion that if you put officers through a similar situation, regardless of what that decision was, many officers would have done a similar reaction than that officer did. And it's when you taking notes and just taking home some of the information that we see in the reality-based training class is so important. And I've even used reality-based training examples where we aim for a certain target and we may be aiming baton strike to the leg, but at the same time the guy's doing a double leg takedown, drops levels, and we're hitting the wrong target, and talking about utilizing like what we learn in reality-based training should spur on other training that we said, wow, well, we did this. Let's take a look at this now from the instructor's point of view, and what can we correct with our tactics, and how can we better our department for maybe this scenario or that scenario, thinking of principles, because we have to get people principle trained, not you need to do this A, B, C, D. It's they need to apply those principles to other scenarios.
So just bringing it back to the original kind of topic of the number one thing most trainers get wrong when delivering reality-based training. It's things aren't black and white, and would you also add maybe they're not focusing on principles enough?
Yeah, not focusing on principles, but that's more so in the training side of things as well. So you'd have to back that up one step, because they need to get those principles in place before they go into reality-based training. But I think what it is reality-based training, in my opinion, my humble opinion, there is no better training for an officer than reality-based training, where they can get it wrong and we can have a discussion about it, and they can walk away understanding it differently. It's like taking a UFC fighter and not allowing him to spar, and then put him into a real fight. And reality-based training is the closest that we can get to sparring as police officers. And but the sparring isn't worth their while if a UFC fighter gets in there and we're putting in somebody that isn't a fighter and isn't of comparable talent than that UFC fighter is. So we need to make sure that with our reality-based training that we're actually, because it is, in my opinion, the best and all training to say, okay, we're going to go from here now, and they go out on the street. So we're going to see is what we taught them in the classroom and on the mats and all these things. We're now going to see, can they put it into game day? So can they do it in a scrimmage just like they do in hockey? Can they make this work when they need to, when they don't know that it's going to come upon them? So if we put all of those things in place, then it's just a matter of ensuring that we have a scenario that is not just I'm going to walk through this scenario, walk out and go, I really didn't pick up a lot from today's training. I shot somebody when I should have, and I didn't shoot them when they shouldn't be trained, and I used my intermediate weapon there. But did you make them engage into that scenario that you're developing with the complexity of that scenario to be a little above maybe where they are?
A lot of really useful stuff here for instructors and trainees to learn. Is there any other final thoughts you'd like to give on this topic?
I'm sorry I know I have a monkey brain. I go all over the place in this, but no, I urge trainers to stick to scenarios that make people think, and that are, if they're walking through them, and the scenarios are, if you're getting 10 out of 10 people that are walking through it, and at the end they're, you're really not changing anything and you're not doing anything, then we as instructors need to up our game and make it so that we understand that it's exactly the same as that UFC fighter. Like I said, we have to have somebody that's a little better at him to get him to train. And our scenarios need to be just a little above the person. They need to get their brains involved, so they can't just go through the motions and understand what's happening. We want to put the right stress. We want to have a list of stress factors. And we go, okay, this student's here, so you're gonna put these stress factors, and we're gonna now, this is the scenario for him. Can we use real world situations and duplicate them? We could, but our point isn't that they know how to do exactly this on this and this, because the totality of the circumstances in situations are never the same from situation to situation. So we want to get fundamental principles to those guys, and then that's trained before they come to reality-based training, and then take that when you're watching students going through. As instructors, we're looking at those students and going, are they actually doing what we've trained them to do? And if they aren't, we either need to change the way we're training them or change our tactics, because there's no point in us continuing on with that scenario, continuing on with that tactic, if you're seeing that they're not going to do it in your reality-based training scenarios.
Well, I think that's very important, useful advice. So thanks again for coming on the program for a second time, and good luck in the future.
Thank you, John. Have a great day.
This has been the Prepared Warrior Podcast. For more info on our guests or other episodes, check out thepreparedwarrior.com. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for the Prepared Warrior Podcast, email jon@thepreparedwarrior.com.